Will you pray with me? Holy and loving God, thank you for the gift of this very moment, for gathering us here as your people, for hearts ready to listen, and for the quiet ways, oh God, that your Spirit is already moving among us. I ask you now that you take the words that I have prepared and breathe your life into them. Where they need strength, give them clarity. Where they need gentleness, give them grace. And let them simply not be my words, but your word, alive and healing and full of love. Open our ears to hear, our minds to understand, and our hearts to receive what you would say to us today. Teach us what it means to embody your love, to live with kindness, to forgive freely, and to see one another as true neighbors. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So St. Francis of Assisi, he was one of the most beloved followers of Jesus in the early church. He was known for his humility and his compassion and his deep care for all of God's creation. He lived in the 13th century in Italy during a time when the church, when the church was wealthy. It was also incredibly powerful at that time, but it was a place that was often distant from ordinary people like you and I. And Francis, he gave up that wealth to live among the poor. He and his small band of followers, they were called friars, went from village to village preaching about the love of Christ, not in cathedrals, but in marketplaces and in open fields and in people's homes. And to those young friars who were eager to share the gospel in that noisy and divided world, Francis shared some powerful words with these young men. He said, "Preach the gospel at all times. Use words if necessary. Preach the gospel at all times. Use words if necessary." I imagine most of you have likely heard some variation of that over the course of your lifetime, but I think it serves as a healthy reminder that the most powerful sermons are the ones that nobody ever hears. They are the ones that we live. Now, of course, if we take this to heart and we really kind of take it a little bit too literally, I'm afraid that Pastor Jason and I will be out of a job. Just kidding. But no matter what, Francis's point, it really remains relevant still today. The gospel isn't something that we just talk about, it is something that we embody. Just talking about Jesus isn't enough if our lives don't resemble Jesus. So what then happens? It's like playing a violin that is completely out of tune. Everyone in the congregation hears the harsh noise and the melody, the beauty and the grace and the love. Well, it is lost somewhere underneath that noise. But here's the good news. Scripture doesn't leave us guessing about what that melody sounds like. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul picks up the tune again and he plays it clearly, note by note, showing us what a life shaped by the gospel really looks like in our everyday actions. You see, he says, in essence, tell the truth. Deal with anger without sin or doing harm. Work honestly, but not for yourself, but so that you can share with those in need. Speak words that build others up. Be kind and be tender-hearted, and forgive as God has forgiven you. And then he sums it all up by saying, therefore, imitate God like dearly loved children. Live your life with love. Follow the example of Christ, who loved us and gave himself for us. That's what it means to embody the gospel. And Paul doesn't leave faith in the clouds for us, just wandering or floating away. What he does is he brings it down to the street level so we can understand and live into this. You see, what he is saying is that this is what love looks like in real life. You see, it's not abstract or mystical, it's practical. Truth-telling and patience and kindness and forgiveness and everyday habits that make grace possible. You see, when we embody the gospel, we are mindful of how we treat the person who is sitting on their phone when the light turns green and you miss the light, and so you have to sit through an entire red light again. You know who you are. It happened to me this week. But you know, it's extending grace. Maybe you have a coworker that just gets on your last nerve, or maybe it's a family member, and they know how to push your buttons no matter what. Whether they do it intentionally or not, who knows? But you insist on avoiding being in their presence instead of embracing the weird quirks and whatever it is that pushes your button, and seeing them as a beloved child of God. You see, it's more about how we handle anger and disappointment and difference, and intentionally showing grace when the world tells us all the time, just get even. Just get even. I think I have said this in every sermon that I've preached since I have been here at Prosper. I think what the world needs is more kindness and more love, especially in the year of 2025. Because if we are being honest, for many people, it's hard to be a good neighbor these days. Goodness, we live in the most connected time in history. We can connect with anyone in any part of the world at any given moment in time. We have a plethora of social media platforms that we can connect with. But hear this. Loneliness is at an all-time high. You see, while people are more digitally linked these days, they are also more emotionally isolated now more than ever. I mean, you can be somebody that has 3,000 friends on Facebook and 1,000 followers on Instagram, and you can still feel utterly alone. And maybe even for many of us, we live in neighborhoods where people just drive into their garages, close the door, and simply vanish. You don't see them again until they pull out in the morning. You know, some people have lived next door to their neighbors for years, and they don't even know their names. And then there's our public life. Well, it's loud, and it's fast, and it's angry. Outrage is at an all-time high, and it gets more clicks and more attention than empathy. You see, if you've ever wandered into the comment section, and I don't recommend you ever doing it, into a social media post or into a news article that somebody has posted, you see how quickly we forget that people on the other side of the screens are our neighbors. And the crazy thing is, Paul's words sound almost radical against the backdrop. We, we are members of one another. He is saying to the people of his time and to the readers, us today, that we belong to each other. Even when we disagree, even when it's inconvenient, even when we don't like each other very much, we don't have to think alike, friends, but we can love alike. And every once in a while, we meet someone who lives that out so clearly. They live it out so clearly that you could almost hear the melody of the gospel in the way that they speak, in the way that they listen, in the way that they care, and in the way that they live their life. And for me, one of those people has always been Fred Rogers, better known as Mr. Rogers. You see, Mr. Rogers wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, he never went viral. I imagine if he tried to start a show today, it probably wouldn't go on the air. He just moved at too slow of a pace for today's society. The producers would probably say, come on, pick it up, Fred, pick it up. Maybe you need some lasers, or maybe you need to add some sort of a dance into this mix. But I believe Mr. Rogers, he knew something when his show started back in 1968. And that is how our culture still struggles to understand that love requires slowness, that kindness requires attention, and that compassion requires presence. You see, as an ordained Presbyterian minister, Mr. Rogers was not called to the church. He was not called to the pulpit. He was called to television. This was a brand new medium. He never, ever preached a sermon from the pulpit. But his entire life was one long sermon about what it looks like to love your neighbor. So often he saw how easily TV could shape and distort the young minds. And he wanted to use this platform for good. You know, he wasn't a fan of the slapstick humor that so many of us find hilarious. He didn't care for a pie going in the face, and he didn't care for people being mocked for laughs, especially children. He often thought and said, you know what, this really isn't funny. How do we find humor in this? It's cruel. So he decided to create something different. And so for 35 years, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood invited children and even adults who were paying attention into a slower, kinder world. And if you ever have watched the show, and if you haven't, I encourage you to Google it, go to YouTube, because he's all over the place. You saw how Mr. Rogers spoke directly to his viewers in a calm and steady voice. He told them they were special, that they were loved, and that they were capable of being a good neighbor. And here's the beautiful thing. Even decades later, in an era of constant scrolling and instant everything, children still respond to his quiet grace. It's as if our souls recognize truth when they hear it, even when it's whispered through the television. You see, Mr. Rogers didn't just talk about love, he lived it. At a time when segregation was still a wound in American conscience, Fred invited Officer Clemmons, a black man, to join him on screen. On a hot summer day, Mr. Rogers filled a wading pool, and he invited Officer Clemmons to cool his feet with him. There was no speech. There was no moral lesson to espouse, just two neighbors standing in the water together. That simple, quiet image of unity and tenderness was a sermon all by itself, a sermon the nation of the time so desperately needed to hear. And then there was Jeff Erlanger. He was a 10-year-old boy who used an electric wheelchair. When Jeff came to the show, Fred didn't rush trying to get to the point of the story. He asked him about his wheelchair and about how it worked and about how Jeff felt. He wanted to know about his feelings. And Jeff's response to how this made him feel, well, he simply smiled at Mr. Rogers and said, "It doesn't make me sad right now, because I'm here talking with you." And then they sang that famous song together. I'm not going to sing it for you, but it's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair, but it's you I like. The way you are right now, the way deep down inside you. Not the things that you hide, every part of you, your skin, your eyes, your feelings, whether old or new. I hope that you'll remember, even when you're feeling blue, that it's you I like. Millions of children saw this episode, and to them, Jeff wasn't the boy in the wheelchair. He was a neighbor. Mr. Rogers understood more than anyone that kindness is not weakness, but it is courage under control. And he even reminded his viewers how Jesus was truthful about his feelings, how he wept and how he got sad and how he got scared. Such a simple yet deeply profound way to share this truth. No, I don't have to remind you that we live in a culture that often tells us to hide your emotions, especially if it shows any kind of weakness. To stay strong at all costs, to keep it together, to smile through it, and guess what? You'll be a better person if you do. But Jesus didn't live that way. No, Jesus wept. He wept at the tomb of Lazarus, and Jesus felt anger in the temple, and Jesus even cried out from the cross in pain and confusion. Mr. Rogers saw the emotional honesty of this sacred, beautiful gift. And he believed that when we make space for our feelings, the good, the bad, and even the messy, we make space for God's grace to enter. And that's why he wrote songs like, "When you feel so mad that you want to roar, take a big deep breath and count to 4. Remember that. I know I will. You know, it might sound really simple, I know, but honestly, we know this is incredibly hard. And I believe it would do wonders for a lot of people to just simply take a deep breath and count to 4 before we post something unnecessary on social media or before we react. You see, you can be angry. Angry is a healthy emotion if it is used for good. And that is why Paul ends that statement with, "But do not sin." You see, Mr. Rogers lived this truth out. He taught that anger isn't the problem. It's what we do with the emotion that truly matters. See, in many places across our country and across our world, embodying the art of neighboring has become a form of resistance. In a world that prizes speed, slowing down to listen is resistance. In a world that encourages suspicion, choosing kindness is resistance. In a world that rewards cruelty, forgiveness is resistance. In a world that celebrates self-centeredness, generosity is resistance. Being a neighbor in the way that Mr. Rogers taught isn't childish, it's Christ-like. And that kind of Christ-like neighborhood can show up in small, everyday ways. Like checking on your elderly neighbor who lives alone, or making space in your schedule to mentor a child, or reaching across political or cultural divide to share a perspective with someone who sees and thinks differently than you over a meal. Listening deeply to someone whose story is very different from your own, and offering grace when someone disappoints you. Remembering how often God has done the same for you. Mr. Rogers used to say, there's no one you couldn't learn to love once you heard their story. There's no one you couldn't learn to love once you know their story. And there are 3 ways to ultimate success. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind. And the third is to be kind. Imagine what the universal church could be if we lived that way, as people who were more curious than judgmental, and more compassionate than defensive. Again, I know this all sounds almost too simple. But in 2025, kindness is a radical stance. Because kindness doesn't sell. Outrage sells, and fear sells, and clearly division sells. But we all know, as followers of the way, we know how kindness and grace and love transforms. So every time you forgive instead of retaliating, you push back the darkness. Every time you listen instead of shouting, you preach peace. And every time you see someone as your neighbor instead of your enemy, you embody the love of God. And that's what Paul meant when he said, be imitators of God as beloved children and live in love. Mr. Rogers' goal was simple: to make television a place where people could find love instead of noise. And I believe the church exists for that same reason today. The church is a place where people come to find love and grace in action instead of noise. The quiet faith of Mr. Rogers and so many other people is a reminder that the gospel doesn't always need a megaphone. Sometimes the only thing it needs is a neighbor. To embody the love of God today is to be a neighbor. In the truest sense. Someone who sees and needs a need and responds with grace. Fred asked a simple question. Won't you be my neighbor? And Jesus asked another, who is my neighbor? The answer to both is found in how we live. Yes, I will be your neighbor. Yes, I will walk in love. Yes, I will practice kindness and forgiveness and grace. Because in a world loud with anger and fear, the quiet work of love still changes hearts, one neighbor at a time. Amen.